Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to our second episode of the 2020 season for the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. In this episode, we are looking at rookie wide receivers, specifically my top 12 for Dynasty and redraft leagues, and we'll break every single one of them down for you. What's up, everybody? My name is Steven Andrus. Welcome into another episode. As we mentioned in the last episode, with everything going on around the country right now, battling this pandemic, going to try and raise a few bucks for a good charity supported by so many of the big names around the fantasy football industry. If you find this content informative, maybe consider donating a couple bucks over at fantasycares.net. Every year, the vast majority of that money goes towards kids whose families can't afford to buy them presents around the holiday season. Let's get started here on this episode, and we're going to unveil my top 12 rookie wide receivers for both Dynasty and redraft leagues. And I'll give you a caveat where it applies if I would have a guy higher in redraft leagues. But this is for Dynasty leagues, so looking over several years who I think is going to have the biggest impact. And I really don't think there's a big consensus on who the number one wide receiver in this class is. So I'm sticking with the one I had number one before the NFL draft, and that's CeeDee Lamb, drafted by the Dallas Cowboys, of course. I think this is a better landing spot than most initially thought when he was drafted. Despite Amari Cooper and Michael Gallup being there, there's still a ton of targets vacated from this offense a year ago. And full disclosure, I've moved Jalen Reagor up to number 2 in my wide receiver dynasty rankings. That is a change from the last episode you'll find here on our YouTube channel. But Jalen Reagor, I love the landing spot, and I love the long-term potential connection with Carson Wentz. Then rounding out the rest of my top tier, that's 5 deep, I have Jeudy from the Broncos, Justin Jefferson on the Vikings, Henry Ruggs III going to the Raiders. Love the talent of all three of these guys, but not quite as much as I love the talent and landing spot of both Lamb and Reagor. Rounding out the rest of my top 12 Dynasty wide receivers, Denzel Mims, Michael Pittman Jr., and T. Higgins, followed by Laviska Shenault, who, if he didn't have injury concerns, I would actually have at the top of this second tier, but he does have injury concerns, along with some maybe instability at the quarterback position in Jacksonville. Brandon Aiyuk way down there at number 10 with San Francisco. I'll explain a little bit why I don't like him as much as the others. Despite being a first-round pick in the NFL draft, it's because he's a senior, and seniors who don't declare early to go to the NFL draft don't have a great track record for fantasy production among wide receivers in fantasy football. And rounding out the top 12, Chase Claypool of the Pittsburgh Steelers and Van Jefferson of the Los Angeles Rams. So let's break down my top 12 Dynasty wide receivers. And before we get into the individual players, some methodology here. One question I always ask myself going into a study of rookie wide receivers each year is, did they declare early or did they stay in college until their senior year? Two of the greatest fantasy minds in the industry studied this, Warren Sharp and Rich Hribar. Sharp found that over the past 10 years, only 6.7% of wide receivers that didn't enter the draft early had a wide receiver 2 or better fantasy season at some point in their career. Now, among wideouts that did declare early for the draft, 31% had a wide receiver 2 or better fantasy season at some point in their career. That is a huge drop-off. So one of the first red flags I look for in rookie receivers, were they a senior in college before they came out into the NFL draft? Rich Hribar also tweeted some great knowledge here to add an extra caveat, another layer on top of that. Non-early declares, aka college senior wide receivers selected in the first round of the NFL draft. So seniors from college who were selected in the first round of the NFL draft. Over the past decade, only a combined 2 top 24 PPR seasons out of 43 seasons played. That caveat applies to one player in the 2020 rookie wide receiver class, and it's the 49ers' Brandon Aiyuk out of Arizona State. which made me severely downgrade him in my rookie wide receiver rankings this year. But let's look at the good, and starting with CeeDee Lamb, my number one wide receiver rookie for Dynasty leagues in 2020. Was he an early declare? Yes, he was. It's a better landing spot than I originally thought. The Cowboys have the second most vacated targets with 190 available. 33% of their targets from a year ago are gone. And better yet, 32% of their air yards from last year are also available. I also think this is a good long-term landing spot for Lamb. The Cowboys could potentially cut Amari Cooper after the 2021 season for no dead cap money, despite him signing a 5-year, $100 million deal this offseason. So Lamb's in a great spot, and I also think Jalen Reagor, his new division rival, is in a great spot as well, of the Philadelphia Eagles. Early declare, yes he was, came out as a junior. The TCU wide receiver only saw a catchable pass on just 61% of his targets. That ranked 118th out of 120 wideouts from a year ago. That is why I'm not putting much stock into him not having a ton of production in college last year compared to some of these other prospects. Compare that 61.4% catchable pass rate to Carson Wentz, who threw a catchable pass on 83.4% of his attempts a year ago. And then combine that with elite speed and fantastic separation from defenders in his route running. And I think Jalen Reagor is primed for early success as well as long-term success, with that depth chart clearing out as early as this season, with maybe Alshon Jeffrey getting cut and Deshaun Jackson always injury prone, it seems, towards the end of his career. My number 3 Dynasty wide receiver, Jeudy from the Denver Broncos. He was my number 1 guy before the draft, but landing spot has knocked him down to number 3. He was an early declare. Really crowded offense, though. Courtland Sutton at wide receiver, Noah Fant at tight end, both great pass catchers. The Broncos also drafted KJ Hamler in the NFL draft, the Penn State wide receiver, and 2 good pass-catching running backs, Melvin Gordon and Phillip Lindsay. You combine a crowded team full of pass catchers with an unstable quarterback situation in Drew Lock, and I think Jerry Jeudy can't be considered one of the top 2 Dynasty wide receivers, albeit I love his route running. He's an incredible route runner, and I have zero concerns about his talent overall. Number 4 rookie wide receiver, Justin Jefferson from the Minnesota Vikings. Stephon Diggs leaves. They draft Jefferson, creating great opportunity for him. So why don't I have him even higher? It seems obvious that he's going to get a lot of targets, right? Maybe not. The Vikings only vacate 94 targets from a year ago. They're just such a run-heavy offense. They have a new offensive coordinator this year. For Jefferson, 98% of his catches came from the slot at LSU a year ago. And how much 11 personnel will the Vikings even play with Kyle Rudolph and Irv Smith Jr. at tight end? The Vikings utilized 11 personnel only 25% of the time last year, by far the fewest in the NFL. So I think Jefferson is in a tough spot here to get a lot of targets. He's going to have to be efficient both in the near term and the long term, as long as the current coaching staff is in place there. My 5th rookie wide receiver is actually the first one off the board in the NFL draft. Henry Ruggs III out of Alabama, now with the Las Vegas Raiders. And a lot of people have been comparing this to when they drafted Darius Hayward-Bay. I think Ruggs is a heck of a lot better than Hayward-Bay. First of all, he can catch. He was an early declare. He had a 149.8 passer rating when targeted in college a year ago. By far the best of any wide receiver prospect in the NFL draft class this year. I do have QB concerns long-term and short-term, though, with Derek Carr there maybe being below average and maybe some instability long-term for what their option is under John Gruden. He is a speedy deep threat, but of the 42 quarterbacks with a minimum of 100 attempts, Derek Carr ranked 40th with a 7.2 average depth of target. He does not throw the ball deep very often whatsoever. That gives me pause and makes me think that this might be a better real-life situation than it is for fantasy in terms of volume and opportunity for targets for Henry Ruggs. Let's move down now to tier 2 of my rookie wide receivers. Big drop off here for the rest of the class, in my opinion. But let's start with number 6, Denzel Mims of the New York Jets. Was he an early declare? No, he wasn't, but he has a fantastic landing spot here to maybe even get targets early on. Only Jamison Crowder and Brashad Perryman ahead of him in the depth chart could theoretically leap both of them his rookie year. He's certainly got the talent. And Perryman is only on a 1-year deal. He'll have the same situation as Mims with an abbreviated offseason on a new team. And then Jamison Crowder, just a slot guy, doesn't get the big plays down the field. And the Jets could potentially save $10 million in cap space if they cut him after the 2020 season. We could be looking at a situation where Denzel Mims is the wide receiver 1 for the Jets as early as this year and at latest next year. Michael Pittman Jr. of the Colts comes up next. He also was not an early declare, but it's, again, a great landing spot. Chance for a lot of targets early on, and I think the Colts showed us how much they thought of Pittman in their behind-the-scenes YouTube show from the NFL Draft. With the second pick in the second round of the draft, they were very much considering taking Jonathan Taylor and really love Jonathan Taylor. They decided to take Pittman first and risk missing out on Jonathan Taylor. He is a guy who could go right into this offense opposite T.Y. Hilton, who's missed a lot of games in recent years, and provide a big, strong target for Phillip Rivers right off the bat after dominating at USC in his senior year a year ago. I think the opportunity is just too great. Now, my next wide receiver, T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. This is where your dynasty situation comes into play. If you're a rebuilding team, you're not so much worried about 2020 production from these rookie wide receivers, then I would actually bump T. Higgins up ahead of Michael Pittman and Denzel Mims. He was an early declare, and we know the much higher success rate of early declare wide receivers. We mentioned that earlier in the show. And it's just hard to ignore the similarities from when the Bengals drafted A.J. Green in the same draft as Andy Dalton to what Cincinnati did here, drafting T. Higgins in the same draft as Joe Burrow. Higgins is a long, athletic receiver, 6'4", long arms. His route running is below average, but we've seen how teams can improve on that. DK Metcalf is the poster child of being able to improve on route running at the NFL level to go along with great athleticism. So keep that in mind. If you're trying to win right away and want early success, maybe Mims or Pittman come first ahead of Higgins. But if you're rebuilding, I would take Higgins over those two non-early declare wide receivers. Moving down to Laviska Shenault of the Jacksonville Jaguars. If he was healthy and if he was in a better landing spot, I would put him at the top of the second tier for me. But he did have core muscle surgery this offseason. He does have a situation where it's an unstable quarterback and an unstable team. Who knows who the quarterback for the Jaguars will be in 2021. It might actually be an improvement if Trevor Lawrence is there, but I do love his athleticism, but that longer track record of injury history bumps Laviska Shenault down to this spot, albeit he's a tank. The comps to A.J. Brown for him are spot on, just an absolute tank who can break tackles after the catch. So I love his athleticism if he can stay healthy. After him, you'll find Brandon Aiyuk. I mentioned earlier the crazy bust rate for first-round wide receivers in the NFL draft. That tells you how much they really liked him and wanted him on their team to add to the strength that they already have at the wide receiver position. So before we wrap up the show, let's take a look at my overall Dynasty top 24. And again, full disclosure, these have been updated from the previous episode we did with rookie running backs. But this will give you an idea where I slot these 12 rookie wide receivers in overall for Dynasty drafts this year. In the history of more immediate impact from top rookie running backs versus rookie wide receivers and landing spots this season, has my top rookie wide receiver CeeDee Lamb behind the top 3 rookie running backs in Clyde Edwards-Helaire, J.K. Dobbins, and Jonathan Taylor. I'm still going to take the rest of the top 5 running backs over the rest of my tier 1 wide receivers because this wide receiver class is so deep that I think you can still get good value in round 2 of Dynasty drafts. In my home Dynasty league, for example, I saw Jalen Reagor go 13th overall. There's just no consensus, it seems, this year in this wide receiver class. After my top 5 wide receivers come off the board, the rest of the wide receivers follow, but only after Bucs running back Keyshawn Vaughn is drafted. I think that's the point of no return for potential instant impact rookie running backs. From that point on, it's safe to take any of the remaining top 10 wide receivers, unless you want to chase the upside of Redskins running back Antonio Gibson. But Gibson also has a very low floor, considering he had less than 100 touches in his entire college career. My wide receiver 11, Chase Claypool, and my wide receiver 12, Van Jefferson, do not crack my top 24 overall Dynasty rankings. They would be round 3 picks for me in Dynasty drafts this year. Thanks so much for joining us on this episode of the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. I hope it was informative for you, give you an idea of how I grade out these rookie wide receivers in an historic 2020 class. Really deep class. I'm not sure there's an alpha wide receiver 1 in this class, but I do think this is going to be a really solid group of future wide receiver 2s in fantasy. We'll just have to wait and see. We'll see you next time.